Hi, it's Christina with the Sisyphean Journal, and today, January 20th, we have a very sad case from 1845. Mary Ackerly of White Plains, New York, was the uneducated daughter of Sutton Ackerly, a shoemaker, and his disreputable wife, Martha. From the time she was around 9 years old, Mary's family had begun sending her to live with other families for reasons that are presumed to be understood by newspaper readers at the time. And Mary did not take well to this peripatetic life, since she rarely stayed with one family more than a few months. In 1845, at the age of 19, Mary went to work in the house of Mrs. C. Nelson near Sing Sing. Now, Mrs. Nelson had a married son, Henry, called Harry, a highly prosperous farmer who lived nearby in Summers. In early December of 1845, Harry convinced Mary to go with him to Manhattan, promising that if she made the trip, he would pay her the $27 that he owed her, which is over $1,000 in 2023. But Harry had other plans for this young woman, who was 4.5 months pregnant with his child. So the two arrived aboard the steamer Croton late Friday evening, December 12th. Harry was dressed as the respectable, comfortable man he was, but Mary was clad in the shabby clothing of her own social class. So it is very unlikely that Harry Nelson was in a serious romance with this young woman. The most likely scenario is that he had offered to pay her for sexual activities, and she was desperate enough to take the money. After they first disembarked, Nelson and Mary were joined by a small, unassuming man in his 30s, clad in a large overcoat with a collar pulled up to hide his face. This man had also been aboard the Croton, but had avoided the couple during the trip. He was Dr. Seth Shove of Bedford, New York. So Shove and Nelson spoke briefly and then parted ways. Nelson then brought Mary to a house of ill fame at 174 Broome Street. The mistress of the house was a Mrs. Brewster. A cook named Mary Ann Murray and a chambermaid named Sarah Canine lived there as well, along with 3 boarders who made a living as prostitutes: Mary Kearney, Josephine Lee, and Emily. And this was evidently a fairly upscale house of ill repute. They plied their trade with lively champagne dinner parties at the house. Nelson and Mrs. Brewster seemed to know each other and spoke briefly before Nelson handed off the young woman to the mistress. Mrs. Brewster saw Mary to a small back room on the first floor and left her there. The night of December 14th, 1845, one of the women who lived at the brothel told Mary that somebody was up in the attic room to see her. When Mary got upstairs, she found Nelson along with Dr. Shove. The room, furnished with a bed, was lit only by a single candle that Nelson held. Nelson told Mary that Shove was there to perform an abortion on her. Mary said that she tried to get out of the room, but Nelson and Shove had locked the door, pushed her onto the bed, and blew out the candle. So Mary didn't see what instruments the appropriately named Shove used on her, but what he did was incredibly painful. Mary told her mother that she had screamed for help, but nobody came. Shove finished what he was doing, and then he and Nelson left. After this ordeal was over, Mary returned to the downstairs back room. Mary Kearney said that the evening of Tuesday, December 15th, Mary Ackerly went into labor. A Dr. Conning came into the house to attend to Mary, and he delivered the baby about 2 o'clock the morning of the 16th. Now, Dr. Conning, evidently believing the infant to be dead, placed it on a marble-top table. But seeing the baby move its hands and foot, Miss Kearney placed the child in a warm place by the stove hearth, where it died about half an hour later. Now, other than doctors attending to her from time to time, Miss Kearney said Mary Ackerly had no visits after the birth and death of her baby. And after the night of the abortion, she never saw Harry Nelson again. She sickened, suffered wretchedly over the ensuing weeks, with her condition deteriorating. During the first week of January 1846, the chambermaid, Sarah Canine, accompanied Mary on a boat trip back to see her family in Sing Sing. Over the ensuing days, Mary had a dark red, foul-smelling vaginal discharge and frequent bouts of vomiting. At Mary's request, she was visited by a minister every other day who prayed with her and urged her to clear her conscience. And as it became clearer to Mary that she wasn't going to recover, she cried and told her mother all about the pregnancy and the abortion. Mary pleaded with her mother to send for Dr. Shove, believing that his knowledge of what he had done to her would aid in providing life-saving care. Shove wouldn't come to attend to his patient, but sent the family a bill for the abortion that had been Rich Henry's idea all along. He was such a slime bag. Dr. William Belcher was the family's usual doctor, and he attended to Mary 3 times before her death. He made it very plain to Mary that she was dying, and she told the same story she told her mother about Harry Nelson, Dr. Shove, and the unfamiliar house she'd been taken to, and the forced abortion. And she was dead by around 6 a.m. on the 20th. Belcher and another doctor performed the autopsy and found multiple adhesions in Mary's uterus. There were no signs of injuries inside the uterus or vagina, but there were injuries causing fecal impaction and large abscesses around the bowel and bladder. And her uterus was enlarged and showed signs of recent pregnancy. So it's very possible that Dr. Shove, doing this in the dark, managed to poke around in the wrong place. And when Shove went to trial for Mary's death, an assortment of doctors testified that they'd known him well and respected him professionally. Some had seen Shove perform surgery and considered him to be skilled. The doctors also testified that for an abortion, the patient would have to be cooperative in order to carry it out. Both hands would be needed by the doctor, so he wouldn't have a spare hand to hold down a struggling patient. And Mary's injuries, as described by Dr. Belcher, were not consistent with those that would happen if a qualified doctor was performing an abortion properly. Now, at no point did the issue seem to be raised nor answered as to whether Mary's injuries were consistent with a skilled surgeon attempting to perform an abortion on a struggling woman in a dark room. As the jury went to deliberate whether Shove should be convicted of murder, manslaughter, or neither, they had to take into account whether Mary had been quick with child, meaning that she'd been able to feel the baby move, whether she had gone to New York specifically for the purpose of an abortion, whether she had consented to it, and whether Shove had indeed been the person who had perpetrated it. And much of this hinged on how much credibility the jury would give to the testimony of Mary's mother and Dr. Belcher regarding what she told them as she lay dying. Shove's attorney had brought forth many witnesses against the character of both Mary and her mother. Mary was described as a thief, a prostitute, and an arsonist, and both women were described as being a bad moral reputation and utterly untrustworthy. The judge told the jury that Martha Ackerly's credibility had been completely impeached, and hence, by implication, they could discount anything she said. The judge also indicated that though Mary ordinarily would be considered of such bad character they could dismiss her testimony as well, they could choose to give credibility to what she said on her deathbed under the presumption, which was common at the time, that people about to meet their maker would want to die having confessed their sins. So some testimony seemed to hinge on whether somebody paid Mary's parents to make themselves scarce after her death. And the implication seems to be that the Ackerly family had been trying to blackmail Dr. Shove. Martha Ackerly said that Shove had given Mary some money, wages that had been due to her. The defense argument was that Shove couldn't have been the person who perpetrated the abortion because it had been done so sloppily. And after all, he was respectable, and Mary and her family were disreputable and couldn't be believed. And this worked, and Shove was acquitted. The verdict was greeted with a perfect thunder of applause from the men in the courtroom who blamed Mary for her own death. And in closing, we can kind of look at the court of public opinion. Mary's story was told in lurid detail in the Police Gazette. During Shove's trial, the defense played up Mary's sordid past and painted her as deserving of the agonizing death she suffered. News coverage, particularly the in-depth coverage in the Gazette, painted Mary as a victim of her circumstances. The true villains of the story were Harry Nelson, who led Mary down the path into prostitution, and Seth Shove, who had taken the instruments in his hand and finished the destruction that Nelson had started.